The highway stretched endlessly into the dark, its black ribbon cutting through a landscape of trees that seemed to close in tighter with every mile. Alex and Jenna were on their way to a remote cabin in the mountains, excited for a weekend escape from the city. The directions, printed on a piece of paper from the cabin rental website, felt oddly quaint. There was no GPS signal this far out. The evening sun had dipped below the horizon, and with each passing moment, the sky grew darker. "Are you sure this is the right way?" Jenna asked, her fingers clutching the passenger seat armrest. Alex glanced at the directions again, squinting in the dim light from the dashboard. "Yeah, it's supposed to get a little rural. We'll hit the turnoff soon." Hours passed. The road grew narrower, twisting through dense woods where the headlights barely penetrated the shadows. When the gas station came into view, a dim oasis in the oppressive dark, both of them sighed in relief. Alex pulled up to the pump, but as he stepped out, the air felt colder than it should have been for a late spring night. The station attendant emerged from the shack, an older man with a weathered face. "You folks headed to the cabin up past Turner's Creek?" he asked without greeting. His eyes didn't quite meet Alex's, instead darting to the woods behind them. "Yeah," Alex replied, handing over cash for the gas. The man hesitated, his hand hovering over the money. "Best get moving then," he said, "and don't stop for anyone." Alex frowned, but before he could ask what the man meant, Jenna called from inside the car. "What's taking so long?" "Nothing," Alex muttered, returning to the car. The old man stood watching them as they drove off, his figure silhouetted in the dim light until the trees swallowed him up. The turnoff came a few miles later, just as the directions had described. A dirt road led them deeper into the woods, the trees closing in so tightly now that their branches scraped the sides of the car. Jenna stared out the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. She didn't like how the night seemed alive out there, how the darkness moved. They had been on the road for what felt like an eternity when Alex slowed the car. Up ahead, a woman stood in the middle of the dirt road, her back to them. She was barefoot, her pale dress hanging loosely around her like it belonged to someone else. Alex and Jenna exchanged a glance. "What the hell is she doing out here?" Alex muttered. He honked the horn lightly, and the woman turned. Her face was wrong. Jenna gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The woman's features were warped, her eyes too far apart, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide. She raised an arm and pointed down the road before disappearing into the woods, her bare feet making no sound on the gravel. "Drive," Jenna whispered. Alex didn't need to be told twice. He pressed the gas, the car lurching forward as the tires spun on the dirt. The cabin was closer now. They could see a faint glow from its porch light through the trees. Relief flooded them as they pulled into the driveway, slamming the car doors and hurrying inside. Jenna locked the door behind them, her hands trembling as she turned the bolt. The cabin was quiet, its rustic charm doing little to calm their nerves. They decided not to unpack right away, choosing instead to sit together on the worn sofa in the living room. Jenna turned on the small, outdated TV, hoping for some noise to drown out the night. Static greeted her. "There's no signal out here," Alex said. He tried to sound casual, but his voice wavered. A noise outside made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunched on the gravel driveway. Alex moved to the window and peeked through the curtain. No one was there. They stayed awake, their nerves frayed, until exhaustion forced them to retreat to the bedroom. Alex checked the locks one last time before joining Jenna under the covers. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually they drifted off. When Jenna woke, the room was bathed in gray dawn light. Alex was gone. "Alex?" she called, her voice hoarse. No answer. She got out of bed, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The cabin was silent. The front door stood open. Heart pounding, she stepped outside. The car was still there, but the driveway was littered with footprints. They circled the car, the cabin, and disappeared into the woods. "Alex!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the trees. The only response was the sound of the wind whispering through the branches. She ran back inside, slamming the door and locking it. Grabbing her phone, she dialed 911, but there was no service. The sound of footsteps started again, this time on the porch. Jenna backed away as "Alex?" she whispered, though she already knew it wasn't him. The door creaked open slowly, the lock snapping like it had never been secure at all. The woman from the road stood there, her mouth impossibly wide in a grin that seemed to split her face in half. Jenna screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the dark. The sign on the highway read, "Exit 13, closed." But Mark and Sarah were too lost to care. Their GPS had died hours ago, and the last town they passed didn't even have streetlights. The fuel gauge was ominously close to empty. Mark, gripping the wheel, glanced at Sarah. "We'll just take it," he muttered. "There has to be a gas station." The turnoff was narrow and poorly lit. The road cracked and overgrown with weeds. It wound through the trees, which seemed to grow denser the farther they drove. The headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and Sarah in the passenger seat kept checking her phone for a signal. Nothing. Then, out of nowhere, a neon light flickered ahead. "Gas and Grub, open 24/7. Mark pulled in, the tires crunching gravel. The station looked ancient, its sign buzzing faintly, casting a sickly green glow over the lot. One rusty pump stood beneath a broken overhang. A single window glowed from inside the small building. Mark stepped out, the cold air biting at him. The pump was so old it didn't even have a card reader. "Cash only," he muttered. He glanced toward the building and saw a figure sitting behind the counter, watching him. Sarah rolled her window down. "Be quick, okay? This place gives me the creeps." Inside, the store smelled of mildew and old grease. The shelves were mostly empty, lined with faded candy wrappers and canned goods coated in dust. The man behind the counter was pale and thin, his skin stretched tightly over his cheekbones. His eyes were sunken and shadowed, but they didn't blink. "Need some gas," Mark said, holding out a $20 bill. The man didn't take it. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and smiled, a wide, too wide smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure," he said slowly, his voice raspy, as though it hadn't been used in years. "But you should leave soon. Don't want to be out here after dark." Mark frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man didn't answer. He simply reached under the counter and pressed something. Outside, the pump clattered to life. Mark hesitated before heading back to the car. As he pumped the gas, Sarah whispered through the window, "Did you see the guy in there? He's weird." Mark nodded. "Yeah, let's get out of here as soon as we're full." The pump clicked off. Mark capped the tank and climbed into the car. As he started the engine, Sarah grabbed his arm. "Mark, look." The man was standing at the window now, his smile gone, replaced by something darker. His pale face was pressed against the glass, his unblinking eyes fixed on them. Mark floored it, gravel spraying as the car sped back onto the narrow road. The gas station disappeared behind them, swallowed by the night. The trees closed in again, their branches scraping the car like skeletal fingers. Sarah kept looking behind them, her face pale. "I don't like this, Mark. I feel like something's following us." Mark wanted to dismiss it, but he felt it too. The air was heavy, oppressive, like the forest itself was alive and watching them. He pressed harder on the gas, the car weaving through the winding road. Then the headlights flickered. "Don't do this," Mark muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The lights flickered again, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed them, the car's engine sputtering to a halt. "No. No. No," Mark hissed, turning the key. The engine wheezed, but wouldn't catch. Sarah was trembling now, her hands gripping the seat. "What do we do?" she whispered. A faint light appeared behind them. At first, they thought it was another car, but as it drew closer, they realized it wasn't headlights. It was a single flickering flame. Mark and Sarah froze, staring as the flame grew larger, brighter, and closer. It stopped about 10 feet from the car, illuminating a figure. It was the man from the gas station. He stood there holding an old lantern, his face unnaturally pale in the glow. His mouth moved, but no words came out. Instead, the sound of distant laughter, high, shrill, and wrong, echoed through the trees. "Mark," Sarah whimpered. "He's not alone." Shapes emerged from the darkness. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, all pale and wide-eyed, their mouths stretched into twisted grins. Their bodies moved unnaturally, their limbs bending at odd angles as they crept closer. "Start the car!" Sarah screamed, but Mark was already trying. The engine roared to life just as the figures reached the car, their hands slapping against the windows. One of them pressed their face against Sarah's window, its eyes black pits, its mouth filled with teeth too sharp, too numerous. Mark floored it, the car lurching forward. The figures clung to the sides, their hands clawing at the doors, their grins widening as they screeched and howled. Mark swerved, the car fishtailing, and finally the creatures were thrown off. The road stretched ahead, endless and dark. Mark didn't stop, didn't look back, not even when the laughter faded. When they finally saw the glow of streetlights in the distance, both of them began to cry. They pulled into a brightly lit diner at the edge of a small town. The car sputtered one last time before dying completely. Inside, the waitress gave them a concerned look. "You kids all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mark and Sarah exchanged a glance. "We got lost near exit 13, Mark said quietly. The waitress's expression froze. Slowly, she shook her head. "There's no exit 13, she said. They closed that road 40 years ago after a family went missing out there. Car found abandoned. No bodies." Mark and Sarah sat in stunned silence as the waitress walked away. When they looked out the window, their car was gone. The rain came down in sheets, turning the winding country road into a slick, treacherous path. Lisa gripped the wheel, squinting through the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up. She'd been driving for hours, and fatigue was settling deep into her bones. The glow of the clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She risked a quick glance. "No signal. Perfect," she muttered. The GPS had cut out miles ago, leaving her reliant on the handwritten directions her friend had given her. She'd been on her way to a remote farmhouse for a weekend getaway, but now, lost in the middle of nowhere, she was starting to regret the trip. Ahead, the beam of her headlights caught something reflective. A figure stood by the side of the road, waving. It was a man in a soaked hoodie and jeans, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. Lisa slowed down instinctively, but hesitated. The rain made it hard to see, but something about him didn't feel right. His stance was too stiff, too still, as if he were frozen in place. "Keep driving," she whispered to herself, pressing the gas pedal. As she passed, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man hadn't moved. He was still standing there, his arm raised in that same rigid wave. Her heart pounded as she focused on the road ahead. The rain seemed to be letting up, but the oppressive darkness pressed in closer. She tried to calm herself, gripping the wheel tighter, when she saw something ahead that made her stomach drop. Another figure stood in the road, waving. This one was a woman in a drenched white dress, her long hair plastered to her face. Lisa slowed to a crawl. "What the hell?" she muttered. She looked closer. There was something strange about the woman's face. Her features seemed blurred, like a photograph smudged by rain. The woman stepped into the middle of the road, forcing Lisa to stop. Lisa honked the horn, her nerves on edge. "Get out of the way," she shouted, her voice shaking. The woman didn't move. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed behind Lisa's car. Lisa's blood turned to ice. Against her better judgment, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man in the hoodie was there, standing directly behind her car, his hood still obscuring his face. "Nope, nope." Lisa slammed the gas, swerving around the woman in the road. Her tires screeched, the car fishtailing briefly before catching traction. She didn't look back. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she sped through the night, the rain finally easing to a drizzle. Minutes passed. The road stretched on endlessly, winding through the woods. She forced herself to breathe, to calm down. Maybe they were just stranded hikers, she reasoned. Weird, creepy hikers, but still. Her grip loosened on the wheel. She focused on the hum of the engine, the rhythmic sound of the tires on wet asphalt. The tension in her shoulders began to fade. Then she heard it, a faint thud from the roof of her car. Her heart stopped. It was subtle, almost like the sound of a branch falling. But as she drove, the thuds continued, soft, deliberate, rhythmic. Someone was on the roof. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. She pressed the gas, trying to outrun whatever nightmare she had stumbled into. The thuds grew louder, more insistent. Tears welled in her eyes as panic clawed at her chest. She saw lights ahead, a gas station. Relief surged through her as she floored the accelerator, pulling into the brightly lit lot. She threw the car into park and jumped out, her hands shaking as she looked up. The roof was empty. Lisa stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The fluorescent lights of the gas station buzzed loudly, their hum filling the silence. A voice startled her. "You okay, ma'am?" She turned to see a gas station attendant, a middle-aged man with a kind face, standing by the door. I think someone was on my car," Lisa stammered, glancing back at the roof. The man frowned and took a cautious step closer. Let's get you inside. You look shaken. Lisa nodded, following him into the gas station. The warm light and the smell of coffee did little to calm her nerves. She sat at a small table as the man poured her a cup. "Where were you coming from?" he asked, handing her the mug. "I'm trying to get to a farmhouse," Lisa said, her voice still unsteady. "But I got lost, and then I saw these people on the road." The man froze, his face growing pale. "What road were you on?" Lisa described it, and his expression darkened. "You shouldn't have taken that route," he said quietly. "Why not?" Lisa asked, her grip tightening on the coffee cup. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the window. "That road, it's been closed for years. There have been stories about people disappearing." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of stories?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze to the security monitor behind the counter. Lisa followed his eyes, and her blood ran cold. The screen showed her car parked beneath the gas station lights. On the roof, a pale hand was gripping the edge, its long, spindly fingers curling around the metal. "Don't move," the man whispered. But Lisa was already screaming. The sky was a blanket of black as David and Mia drove through the desolate countryside. Their old sedan rattled on the uneven road, the headlights illuminating nothing but endless fields of dry grass. They were on their way to a camping trip with friends, but had gotten a late start. Now, hours past sunset, they were alone in the middle of nowhere. "I told you we should have left earlier," Mia said, crossing her arms. David sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. "We're fine. The map says the campsite is only 20 more miles." "Yeah, if we're on the right road," Mia muttered, glancing nervously out the window. She hated the way the darkness pressed against the glass as though it were alive. The car's engine suddenly sputtered, jerking them forward. "No, no, no," David muttered, slapping the dashboard. The car groaned and slowed, eventually coasting to a stop. "You've got to be kidding me," Mia said, her voice rising in panic. "What's wrong with it?" David twisted the key in the ignition, but the engine refused to catch. He checked the gauges. "We're out of gas," he admitted, slumping back in his seat. Mia's jaw dropped. "You said we had enough to make it." "I thought we did," David shot back, his frustration evident. They sat in tense silence for a moment before David pulled out his phone. "No signal," he said, holding it up as though that might help. "Great," Mia muttered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Now what?" David grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. "There was a house about half a mile back," he said. "We can ask for help." Mia stared at him. "You're kidding. That place looked abandoned." "Do you have a better idea?" he asked, already opening the door. The cold night air rushed in, making Mia shiver. Reluctantly, she followed, clutching her own flashlight as they trudged back up the road. The night was eerily quiet, the only sounds their footsteps crunching on gravel and the occasional rustle of wind through the grass. The house came into view, a hulking silhouette against the night sky. It was a 2-story farmhouse, its paint peeling and its windows dark. The porch sagged under the weight of time. "This place screams, 'Don't go inside,'" Mia whispered. David ignored her, climbing the creaking steps and knocking on the door. The sound echoed through the empty house. They waited, the silence stretching on. "Let's just go back," Mia urged, but David knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open. They both froze, their flashlights trained on the doorway. Inside, the house was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic. "Hello?" David called out. His voice sounded small in the oppressive silence. No answer. "This is a bad idea," Mia said, tugging at his sleeve. But David stepped inside, shining his flashlight around. The house was eerily intact. A dusty couch sat in the living room, and a grandfather clock stood frozen at 3:15. Family photos hung crookedly on the walls, their glass cracked. The faces in the pictures were blurred as though the film had decayed over time. "Maybe no one's home," David said, his voice uncertain. "Maybe no one's been home for years," Mia replied, edging toward the door. A loud thud echoed from upstairs. They both froze. David's flashlight trembled slightly in his hand. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered. David nodded. "Probably just an animal. Let's check it out." Mia grabbed his arm. "Are you insane? We should leave." But David was already heading toward the staircase. Mia cursed under her breath, but followed, her flashlight casting long, jittery shadows. The stairs creaked ominously under their weight. At the top, the hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors that were all slightly ajar. The air was colder up here, carrying the faint smell of rot. "Let's just call out and go," Mia whispered. "Good idea," David said. He cleared his throat. "Hello? Is anyone here? We just need help." The house was silent. They moved cautiously down the hall, peeking into each room. Most were empty, filled only with broken furniture and more blurred photographs. But the last door on the right was closed. David hesitated, his hand hovering over the knob. Mia shook her head furiously, mouthing, "No." Ignoring her, David turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was small and bare, except for a single wooden chair in the center. On the chair sat an old radio, its dial glowing faintly. "What the hell?" Mia whispered. David stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the radio. It was emitting a low, static hiss. "Maybe it's battery-powered?" David guessed, but Mia was already backing away. "Let's leave. Now," she said, her voice trembling. Before David could respond, the static cut off with a sharp click. A voice came through the speaker, soft and distorted. "You shouldn't be here." David and Mia froze. "What?" David started, but the voice cut him off. "They're watching." The air grew impossibly heavy. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Mia screamed, dropping her flashlight as the room plunged into darkness. David grabbed her hand, yanking her toward the door. But it wouldn't budge. "Open it," Mia cried, pounding on the wood. Behind them, the radio crackled to life again. The voice was louder now, angrier. "Run!" The room's temperature plummeted, and a shadow darker than the night itself began to seep from the walls, curling toward them like smoke. The door finally gave way, and they tumbled into the hallway. The shadows were spilling out of the room, chasing them down the stairs. David and Mia ran, their breaths ragged as they bolted out of the house and back onto the road. They didn't stop running until the car was in sight. David fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, as Mia kept glancing over her shoulder. The shadows hadn't followed, but the oppressive feeling hadn't left. The engine roared to life, and they sped away, not daring to look back. They never found the campsite. They drove straight home, abandoning their weekend plans. Weeks later, David Googled the farmhouse, trying to make sense of what they'd seen. The house had burned down decades ago, killing an entire family. No one had lived there since. It was supposed to be a shortcut. Beth and Jason had been driving for hours, trying to get to a cabin their friends had rented deep in the woods. The GPS suggested an alternate route, a narrow, winding road that cut through a forest. It was barely more than a gravel path, but it promised to shave 30 minutes off their drive. Against Beth's protests, Jason turned onto it. The road quickly became rougher, the trees pressing closer as their branches stretched across the sky like skeletal arms. The headlights barely cut through the oppressive darkness. The radio, which had been playing soft music, fizzled out into static. Jason turned it off with a muttered curse. "Maybe we should turn around," Beth said, her fingers drumming anxiously on the dashboard. Jason shook his head. "It's fine. The map says this connects to the main road in 10 miles. They drove on in silence. The only sounds, the crunch of gravel under the tires and the faint hum of the engine. Beth stared out the window, her unease growing. The trees outside seemed impossibly tall, their trunks gnarled and twisted. Every so often she thought she saw movement, shadows shifting between the trees, flickering in the corners of her vision. She told herself it was just the headlights playing tricks. The road narrowed further, forcing Jason to slow down. The air inside the car felt heavier, colder, though the heater was still running. Beth glanced at the dashboard. "Jason," she said, her voice tight. "The gas light's on." Jason frowned. "What? That's impossible. I filled up before we left." "Well, it's on now," Beth snapped, her unease morphing into anger. "You said this was a good idea." Jason's foot slammed on the brakes, sending them lurching forward. "Did you see that?" he hissed. "See what?" Beth asked, her heart pounding. She followed his gaze, but the road ahead was empty. Jason shook his head, gripping the wheel tightly. "I swear, there was something in the road. It looked like a person." Beth's stomach twisted. "Maybe we should go back." Jason didn't respond. He started driving again, slower this time. The forest seemed darker now, the trees looming closer, their branches scraping against the car like nails on a chalkboard. Then they saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by the headlights. It was a man, tall, thin, and barefoot. He wore tattered clothes that looked soaked and dirty. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eyes glowed faintly in the light. Jason hit the brakes again, his hands trembling. "What the hell is he doing?" he whispered. Beth grabbed his arm. "Don't stop." Just go around him. Jason hesitated, but the man didn't move. His glowing eyes stared directly at them, unblinking. Jason, go! Beth yelled. Jason swerved around the man, the tires kicking up gravel. As they passed, Beth couldn't stop herself from looking. The man's head turned to follow them, his neck bending even further, as though it might snap. Beth screamed. Jason floored it, the car careening down the uneven road. The gas light was now blinking insistently, but neither of them said a word. Jason's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and Beth was clutching her seatbelt so tightly her fingers ached. The car jolted violently as the road suddenly ended in a ditch. Jason slammed the brakes, but it was too late. The car lurched forward, its front end sinking into the mud. Are you kidding me? Jason yelled, slamming his fists on the wheel. Beth turned to him, her face pale. We need to get out of here. Jason nodded, grabbing his phone. No signal, he muttered. He opened the door, grabbing a flashlight from the back seat. I'll check if we can push it out. Beth grabbed his arm. Don't go out there. Do you want to stay stuck here all night? Jason snapped, pulling away. He stepped into the cold night air, the flashlight cutting through the fog that had suddenly rolled in. Beth stayed in the car, her heart hammering as she watched him circle to the front. He crouched, inspecting the damage, muttering curses under his breath. Something moved behind him. Jason, Beth screamed. He turned, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. What? What is it? Beth pointed frantically, but the fog was so thick now that she could barely see him, let alone what had been there. Jason straightened, shining the flashlight around. There's nothing here, he said, though his voice wavered. Then the sound came. A low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to reverberate in Beth's chest. Jason froze, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The growl came again, closer this time. Jason backed toward the car, his eyes wide. Get in the driver's seat, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. What? Beth asked, her voice trembling. Now! Jason snapped, scrambling back into the passenger side. Beth climbed over the console, her hands fumbling with the keys. She turned the ignition, praying the car would start. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. Jason was staring out the windshield, his face pale. Drive! Beth didn't ask questions. She slammed the car into reverse, the tires spinning in the mud before catching. They lurched backward, the headlights briefly illuminating the figure standing at the edge of the fog. It wasn't the man from before. This figure was taller, its limbs impossibly long, its body contorted, its glowing eyes locked onto them, unblinking. Beth screamed, slamming the car into drive. The car bounced back onto the gravel road, the tires screeching as they sped away. The fog swallowed the road behind them, but the oppressive feeling didn't leave. They didn't stop, not even when they reached the main road, where the forest finally gave way to open fields. It wasn't until they saw the lights of a small gas station that Beth pulled over, her hands shaking too badly to keep driving. Jason stumbled out of the car, his face pale and drawn. What the hell was that? He whispered. Beth didn't answer. She didn't have one. All she knew was that when she glanced at the car's rear window, she saw two faint, glowing eyes reflected in the glass. It was just supposed to be a night drive. Katie had always loved the solitude of the open road, especially at night. The hum of the engine, the glow of the dashboard, the cool breeze when she rolled the window down. It was her escape. That night, she set out on a familiar route, a quiet highway that cut through miles of dense forest. The kind of road where you wouldn't see another car for hours. At first, everything was peaceful. The moonlight filtered through the trees, and the road stretched endlessly before her. She played her favorite playlist, letting the music drown out her thoughts. But as the miles ticked by, something shifted. Her headlights began flickering. Katie frowned, tapping the dashboard. Not now, she muttered. Her car was old but reliable. Until now. The flickering grew worse, plunging the road ahead into near darkness before the lights came back on, weaker than before. She turned off the music, suddenly feeling exposed in the silence. The forest seemed too quiet, the stillness oppressive. Even with her windows up, she swore she could feel the night pressing against the car. A shadow crossed the road ahead. Katie hit the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car jerked to a stop, skidding slightly on the gravel. She peered through the windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The shadow had been fast, too fast for her to make out any details. She waited, her breath shallow, but the road was empty. Nothing moved in the trees. After a few moments, she laughed nervously, shaking her head. Probably a deer, she muttered. She pressed the gas and kept going, but she couldn't shake the unease. Her headlights seemed weaker now, barely illuminating the road. The forest pressed closer, the trees almost suffocating. A sudden noise made her jump, a sharp thunk against the back of her car. Katie glanced in the rearview mirror, hummed dismay, but the darkness swallowed everything behind her. Her pulse quickened as she leaned forward, straining to see ahead. "It's nothing," she whispered to herself. "Just a rock kicked up or something." But then she felt it. A weight, subtle at first, pressing down on the car's roof. Her stomach turned to ice. The car swayed slightly, the weight shifting. Katie froze, her knuckles white as she gripped the wheel. She didn't dare look up. The weight grew heavier, as if whatever was on the roof was crawling closer. The faint sound of scraping metal reached her ears, slow and deliberate. She slammed the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. Whatever was on the roof shifted, but didn't fall off. Katie's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she sped down the road, the car swerving wildly. "Get off! Get off!" she screamed. The scraping stopped abruptly. The weight was gone. Katie didn't slow down. Her headlights illuminated a small clearing up ahead, a spot where the road widened. She skidded to a stop, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. No signal. Of course. She debated whether to step outside, but the thought of staying in the car wasn't much better. Swallowing her fear, she opened the door and stepped into the night. The cool air hit her like a slap. She circled the car, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The roof was empty. No dents, no marks. The back of the car was clean too, save for a thin streak of mud across the trunk. Katie exhaled shakily. "Just my imagination," she muttered. As she turned back to the driver's side, her flashlight caught something in the trees. A pair of eyes, low to the ground, reflecting the beam. Katie froze. The eyes didn't blink. They were too close together, too high for an animal, but too low for a person. They stared at her unblinkingly, glowing faintly in the darkness. She took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. "Hello?" she called out, though her voice cracked. The eyes moved. No, they rose. Slowly, impossibly, they lifted higher until they were level with her own. Katie stumbled, dropping her flashlight. She fumbled to grab it, the beam swinging wildly. When she pointed it back to the trees, the eyes were gone. Her car door slammed shut. Katie spun around, her blood running cold. The driver's seat was empty, but the car was idling. She could see the glow of the dashboard through the window, the keys still in the ignition. And then she noticed it, a faint smear on the inside of the window. A handprint, too large to be human, with elongated fingers that tapered to sharp points. It was pressed against the glass as if something had been watching her from the inside. Katie didn't scream. She couldn't. Her body was frozen, paralyzed by the icy grip of fear. The car engine revved, then roared to life as the car lurched forward on its own, speeding down the road and vanishing into the darkness. Katie was left standing there, alone on the deserted road, the trees whispering around her. And then she heard it, the crunch of gravel behind her, slow, deliberate footsteps. She didn't turn around. The rain started just as Emma turned onto the winding mountain road. She hadn't planned on driving so late, but a delayed meeting in the city had left her behind schedule. Her destination was a secluded Airbnb, a cozy cabin tucked into the hills. She'd been looking forward to the solitude, a weekend away from her busy life. The road was steep and poorly maintained, the rain turning it into a slick, treacherous path. Her GPS warned that there was no signal ahead, but she shrugged it off. She downloaded the directions and felt confident she'd get there before the storm worsened. About 20 minutes in, she saw a hitchhiker. The figure stood at the edge of the road, drenched but motionless, illuminated by her headlights. A man in a dark hoodie and jeans, his face obscured. He wasn't holding out his thumb or waving for help. He was just standing there, facing the road, as if waiting. Emma's grip on the wheel tightened. She slowed slightly but kept driving. Something about the way he stood, so still, so rigid, unnerved her. As she passed him, her headlights briefly caught his face, or rather, the absence of one. Her heart lurched. His features were blurred, as though smeared with paint, his eyes dark pits that seemed to absorb the light. Emma hit the gas, her tires skidding slightly on the wet road. She glanced in her rearview mirror. He was gone. Her pulse raced as she tried to rationalize what she'd seen. The rain, the poor lighting, it must have been an illusion, she told herself. Her mind playing tricks, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She turned off the music, needing to focus. The road became narrower, the trees on either side towering like sentinels. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, though there was no one else around. Then her car's dashboard lights flickered. "No, no, no," she whispered, as the engine sputtered. The car slowed, the headlights dimming until she was left in near total darkness. She coasted to a stop, the rain pounding on the roof like a drumbeat. Emma took a shaky breath. "It's just a breakdown," she told herself. She reached for her phone. No signal. She flicked on the hazard lights and grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. Maybe she could figure out what was wrong with the engine. She didn't relish the idea of stepping into the storm, but she couldn't just sit there. The flashlight beam cut through the rain as she popped the hood. The engine hissed, steam rising into the cold air. She leaned in, but nothing looked obviously wrong. Not that she would have known what to look for. Frustrated, she slammed the hood shut and turned to get back in the car. That's when she saw him again. The hitchhiker stood in the middle of the road, about 20 feet away. This time, there was no mistaking it. His face, or lack thereof, was tilted toward her. The rain didn't seem to touch him. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. The beam spun wildly, casting eerie shadows that made the man seem to loom closer. "Stay away," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the storm. The man didn't move. Emma scrambled back into the car, locking the doors. Her hands fumbled as she tried to restart the engine. It sputtered but didn't catch. She hit the wheel in frustration, her eyes darting to the windshield. He was closer. He hadn't walked. He hadn't run. But somehow he was now standing at the edge of her headlights. The rain distorted his outline, but his head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as if studying her. The lights flickered again, and for a heart-stopping moment they went out completely. When they came back on, he was gone. Emma sobbed, her fear overwhelming. She tried the engine again, and this time it roared to life. She didn't waste a second, flooring the gas and speeding down the slippery road. The car fishtailed, but she kept going, desperate to put as much distance between her and that thing as possible. The cabin finally came into view, a small structure with a single porch light glowing faintly through the rain. Emma pulled into the driveway, practically jumping out of the car and running to the door. She fumbled with the key the host had left in the lockbox, her hands trembling. The interior was cozy, just as the listing had promised, but Emma barely noticed. She locked every door and window, pulled the curtains tight, and collapsed onto the couch, her chest heaving. Safe. She was safe. Or so she thought. The storm raged on outside, but the cabin was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Emma noticed it after a while. No creaking floorboards, no hum of the refrigerator, just silence. And then the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent her heart into overdrive. The knock came again, this time louder. Emma crept to the peephole, her stomach twisting. No one was there. She backed away from the door, her pulse racing. The knock came again, this time from the window. She spun around, but the curtains were drawn. She could see the silhouette, though. A tall figure standing impossibly still, its head tilted at that unnatural angle. "Leave me alone," she screamed, grabbing a fire poker from the hearth. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain. Emma stayed frozen, gripping the poker so tightly her hands hurt. She inched toward the window, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Slowly, she pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The porch light flickered, then went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. Emma's phone buzzed, and she snatched it up, hope surging. But it wasn't a call or a text. It was a notification she didn't recognize, a single message displayed in bold letters. "Let me in." Her screen went black. The sky was an eerie shade of purple as Dan and Leah drove through the desert. It had been a long day of driving, and they were miles away from the next town. Their car, packed with camping gear, snacks, and a playlist of road trip songs, had started to feel more like a coffin in the endless expanse of sand and rock. "We should have reached the motel by now," Leah said, frowning at the GPS. It had lost signal an hour ago, leaving them to guess their way down a desolate, two-lane highway. The road was cracked and uneven, the kind of stretch that seemed forgotten by time. Dan glanced at her. "We're fine. It's probably just around the next bend." Leah sighed, staring out at the horizon. The sun had dipped below the mountains, leaving only a faint glow that quickly faded into night. The desert came alive in the dark, shadows moving, strange sounds echoing. But tonight, it felt different. Wrong. The first sign of trouble came when the headlights flickered. Dan cursed, smacking the dashboard. Not now. Leah sat up straighter, her stomach twisting. What's wrong? I don't know. Electrical issue, maybe. The car jerked suddenly, as if something had yanked it backward. Dan slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a stop. Dust rose around them, illuminated in the dim glow of the flickering headlights. Leah gripped the seat. What the hell was that? Dan opened the door, stepping into the cool desert air. Probably just a pothole. Don't! Leah's voice cracked. Stay in the car. Dan ignored her, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. He circled the car, shining the beam on the road. Nothing. The tires were intact, no signs of damage. But as he bent down to check the undercarriage, his light caught something strange. A footprint. It was pressed into the dirt near the edge of the road, and it wasn't human. Too large, too deep. The shape was all wrong. Long, clawed toes spread unnaturally wide. Dan straightened, scanning the darkness. Leah, I think there's an animal out here. Leah rolled down her window, her voice trembling. Get back in the car. Now. Dan hesitated, then nodded, climbing back in and locking the doors. The silence inside the car was deafening. Leah whispered, Do you hear that? Dan strained his ears. At first, there was nothing. But then, faintly, he heard it. A low, rumbling growl. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding them. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned the key, desperate to start the car, but the engine sputtered and died. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of something heavy moving just beyond the reach of the headlights. Leah gripped his arm. Dan, do something! I'm trying! He snapped, turning the key again. The car whined but refused to start. The headlights flickered one last time and went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Leah gasped, her eyes wide as she stared out the windshield. Dan! He followed her gaze, his breath catching in his throat. A figure stood in the road, illuminated faintly by the moonlight. It was tall, hunched, with long, sinewy limbs that ended in claws. Its head was misshapen, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. Dan fumbled for the flashlight, his hands shaking. He pointed it at the figure, but the beam barely reached it. As the light hit the creature, it let out a bone-chilling screech, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their skulls. It moved. Not running, not walking, but gliding toward them, its body jerking unnaturally as it closed the distance. Leah screamed, slamming her hands against the dashboard. Dan, go! Dan turned the key one last time and the engine roared to life. He slammed the gas, the tires screeching as the car shot forward. The creature vanished from view as they sped down the road, but Leah kept glancing over her shoulder, her heart pounding. Is it gone? She whispered, barely able to speak. Dan didn't answer. His knuckles were white on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. The car's headlights flickered again, but they stayed on just long enough to reveal something up ahead. A figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, identical to the creature they'd just escaped. Dan swerved, narrowly avoiding it, but the car spun out, skidding onto the shoulder. The engine died again, the headlights dimming. Leah was sobbing now, her hands pressed to her face. We're not going to make it. Dan grabbed her hand, his voice firm. We are. Just stay calm. A tapping sound came from the window, slow, deliberate. Leah turned, her breath hitching. The creature was outside, its glowing eyes staring in. Its claws scraped against the glass, leaving deep gouges. Dan grabbed the flashlight and shone it in the creature's face, but it didn't flinch. Instead, it smiled. The expression was wrong, grotesque, stretching its face in ways that defied anatomy. Dan grabbed a tire iron from under the seat. Stay here. No. Don't. Leah's plea was cut off as Dan flung open the door, swinging the tire iron at the creature. It moved faster than he anticipated, dodging the blow and slamming into him with unnatural force. Dan hit the ground, the flashlight spinning out of his hand. Leah screamed as the creature loomed over him, its claws glinting in the moonlight. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. It turned its head toward Leah, cocking it at an unnatural angle. Then it grinned again, wider this time, before retreating into the darkness. Dan scrambled back into the car, bleeding and shaking. He turned the key, and miraculously, the engine started. They didn't stop driving until they reached the next town, the lights of a gas station a beacon of safety. When they finally stopped, Leah turned to Dan, her voice barely a whisper. What was that? Dan didn't answer. He couldn't. But as he stepped out of the car, he noticed something on the roof, a deep, clawed scratch that stretched from the hood to the trunk. And in the dirt beside the gas station, those same inhuman footprints. The summer road trip had been Mike's idea, a cross-country drive to see the landmarks he and his girlfriend Sarah had always talked about. They'd mapped out every detail: the Grand Canyon, Mount Rushmore, Yellowstone. It was supposed to be an adventure, the kind they'd tell stories about for years. But now, as they turned onto the narrow, twisting forest road that Mike had insisted was a shortcut, Sarah had a sinking feeling in her gut. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, and the road was too quiet. The dense canopy of trees overhead blocked out the moonlight, and the only sound was the hum of their car engine. "We should have stayed on the highway," Sarah muttered, her eyes scanning the dark woods. "It'll be fine," Mike said, though his voice lacked confidence. "This cuts an hour off the drive. Trust me." She didn't. The car's headlights caught something ahead, a small sign, hand-painted and leaning awkwardly to one side. It read, "Welcome to Cold Pines, population 86. "Great," Sarah said. "You've taken us to a horror movie set." Mike chuckled nervously. "It's just a small town. We'll be through it in no time." But when they reached the town, there was no sign of life. The road wound through a collection of decrepit buildings: a diner with shattered windows, a gas station with rusting pumps, a general store whose wooden sign hung crookedly by one chain. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Mike slowed the car to a crawl. "Weird," he said. "You'd think there'd be—" A figure stepped into the road. Sarah screamed as Mike slammed on the brakes. The car screeched to a stop mere feet from the person, a man, gaunt and pale, wearing tattered clothes. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted, his eyes fixed on them. His expression was blank, unsettlingly so. Mike rolled down his window an inch. Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. He just stared, unblinking. Mike shifted uncomfortably. "Okay, then." He rolled the window back up. "Let's get out of here." As he started to drive around the man, Sarah's hand shot out. "Wait. Look." More figures were emerging from the shadows between the buildings. Men, women, even children, all wearing the same blank expressions. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and they all turned to face the car as it passed. Mike accelerated. "What the hell is this?" Sarah didn't answer. She was too focused on the figures, their eyes following the car like predators watching prey. One of them, a woman with tangled hair and a torn dress, raised her arm and pointed at them. "Go faster," Sarah whispered. Mike floored the gas, the car speeding out of the town and back into the woods. The rear-view mirror showed the figures receding into the distance, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching. The road twisted and turned, the forest growing denser. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them. Mike gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Then the car's engine sputtered. No, Mike said, pounding the dashboard. The car coasted to a stop, the headlights flickering before plunging them into darkness. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps. "What's happening?" "I don't know. It just died." Mike grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. He cursed under his breath. "I'll check under the hood." "Don't," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We're safer in here." But Mike was already opening the door. The dome light flickered on, illuminating the interior for a brief moment before winking out. Sarah locked the doors behind him, her hands shaking. Mike popped the hood and leaned in, his flashlight casting harsh shadows. Everything looked normal. No smoke, no leaks. But then he heard it, a rustling in the trees. "Hello?" He called out, the flashlight beam swinging wildly. The rustling grew louder, closer. Mike's heart pounded as he backed away from the car, his eyes scanning the dark forest. He thought he saw movement, something large moving fast between the trees. "Mike, get back in the car," Sarah shouted, her voice muffled through the glass. He turned to run, but something burst out of the woods, a shape black and hulking, with limbs that moved too fast, too unnaturally. Mike screamed as it lunged toward him. Sarah watched in horror as the flashlight hit the ground, spinning wildly. The beam illuminated flashes of Mike's struggle, a glimpse of claws, a flash of something too many teeth. And then, silence. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she gripped the steering wheel, paralyzed with fear. She didn't dare open the door. She sat in the dark, the only sound her ragged breathing. Then came the tapping. It was soft at first, a delicate rapping on the driver's side window. Sarah froze, her eyes wide. Slowly, she turned her head. Mike was there, or what was left of him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and lifeless. Blood dripped from his mouth, staining his shirt. He tilted his head, just like the man in the road, and raised his hand to tap again. "Let me in," he whispered, his voice a guttural croak. Sarah screamed, fumbling with the keys. The car wouldn't start. Outside, the rustling returned, louder now, closer. She could see shapes in the trees, dozens of them, all moving toward the car. The tapping grew louder. More hands pressed against the windows, more faces emerging from the dark. They were surrounded. And then everything went silent. For a moment, Sarah thought it was over. But then, from somewhere in the woods, a voice whispered, clear and cold, "You're next." The last thing Sarah saw was the shadow descending over the car, blotting out the faint moonlight.